Good evening and welcome to Mining the Riches of the Parsha. Tonight is Thursday night, July 17th, 2025. We do not have Korbonos today, the sacrifices that were offered in the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. We do not have a Beit HaMikdash. We do not have the sacrifices, the offerings, but we still study the details of each of the Korbonos, each of the sacrifices, for several reasons. One reason is because we've discussed this before, that God made a promise to the Jewish people that when there is a time that there will no longer be Korbonos, God will accept if we study the sacrifices, we study the details of them, God will consider it as if we had actually offered it. And that's the reason that even today, in the Musaf Amidah, the added Amidah that we add on Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh and Yom Tov, we actually give the details of the korban, the sacrifices that were offered on that special day. And number two, the second reason is because learning the details of the sacrifices, even though we do not have them, teaches us very important, relevant lessons. Good to see you, Mo. Welcome. Thank you for coming. And specifically, if we pay attention to the details, what seem like minute details, we can derive very interesting lessons about the days themselves, the holy days themselves. For example, our Torah portion, the Parsha Pinchas, has a long passage that describes the unique korbanos, the sacrifices that were offered for each Shabbos and each Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of the Jewish month, and each Yom Tov, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur. Every one of them had slightly different offerings, and so this passage gives the details of every single one of them. Now, I just want to point out that even though offering a korban involves actions that are normally prohibited on Shabbos, slaughtering an animal, lighting a fire, burning something, these are all prohibited on Shabbos. However, what the Torah is telling us in this week's Torah portion is that God is specifically saying, on these days, I want you to set aside the laws of Shabbos and offer these sacrifices. But, by the way, only these, which are communal sacrifices, they're offered on behalf of the entire Jewish people, no individual sacrifice. So you didn't have a person who had their own individual korban to bring, they would not bring it on Shabbos. Only these that are mentioned in this week's Torah portion. Okay, so let's take a look and start with Shabbos. Ubiyam HaShabbos, and on Shabbos, you offer shnei kvasim, 2 sheep. And that is olas Shabbos. That is a korban ola. A korban ola means that it was placed after it was slaughtered, and it was placed on the altar, and it was burned on the altar. It was not eaten by the Kohanim. It was not eaten by any individual, because it was not an individual sacrifice. It was on behalf of the entire people, and it was in order to demonstrate the holiness of the day of Shabbos. Now, that is Shabbos, 2 sheep, shnei kvasim. B'Rosh Chodeshim, on Rosh Chodesh, there is also an ola offering, but instead of 2, it was shiva tamimim, 7 sheep. So that's going to be one difference between Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh. And by the way, every other Yom Tov, Pesach, 7 sheep. Shavuot, 7 sheep. Et cetera, et cetera. All the other times, it's 7. But on Shabbos, it's 2. That's one difference. And the other difference is, I said to you that on Shabbos, there's only the korban ola, a korban that is completely burnt on the altar. But on all the others, there is also seir izim echad lechatas, a goat that was offered as a chatas, as a sin offering. So that means on Rosh Chodesh, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, there was the Ola, different in number from Shabbos to Yom Tov, and also there was a Korban Chatas, a sin offering, which was not offered on Shabbos. So let's try to understand these two differences. Why is it that on Shabbos there were only 2 sheep offered, and every other time it was 7? Well, there are several suggestions among the commentators. It could be that the number 2 is very important to Shabbos in general. It reminds us of Zachar v'Shamar, the 2 different words that are used in the Torah to describe Shabbos. We're obligated to remember Shabbos to keep it holy, and we're obligated to guard Shabbos to keep it holy. So Shabbos has these 2 components of remembering and guarding, and therefore there are 2 animals that were offered that correspond to those 2 obligations. Okay. Why is it that on Shabbos there's no Korban Chatas, there's no sin offering, but on Rosh Chodesh and Yom Tov there is? It seems very strange. On Yom Tov, especially Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, there's a mitzvah of simcha, to rejoice. So what kind of sinning are we talking about that requires a sacrifice of a sin offering, a Korban Chatas? This detail, I think, will distinguish for us a very important distinction between Shabbos and Yom Tov in the sense of what is the source of the holiness of those 2 days. On Rosh Chodesh, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Yom Tov, when we say the Amidah, the middle part, we make a bracha, Baruch atah Hashem, blessed be you God, Mekadesh Yisrael v'hazmanim. You've sanctified Israel and the special times. If it's on Pesach, you sanctified Israel, and you sanctified this day as Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot, etc. What does that mean? Well, who is in charge of sanctifying the holidays? It's not God. God transfers the authority to sanctify the holidays to the Jewish people, because the holidays follow the Jewish calendar. And who decides the Jewish calendar? Well, that is the Jewish people, represented by the Sanhedrin, the great court in Jerusalem. And they would decide, let's say, for example, today is Rosh Chodesh, and that means in a certain number of days, it's going to be Pesach. So God does not sanctify Pesach. God sanctifies the Jewish people, and the Jewish people sanctify Pesach. Same thing with Rosh Chodesh, Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. The sanctification comes from us. Our authority to sanctify comes from God, but the sanctification comes from us. Here's the thing. We do not always live up to what we're supposed to do. Perhaps we did not sanctify it properly. Perhaps there was some imperfection in the way that we did it. And therefore, we bring a Korban Chatas, a sin offering, not for any individual sin, because remember, on Yom Tov, we don't bring any individual sin. It's a communal offering. The Jewish people as a whole maybe did not do it entirely properly, and therefore there's something lacking, so we have a Korban Chatas, a sin offering. On Shabbos, who sanctifies Shabbos? God sanctifies Shabbos. Shabbos comes automatically every 7th day. A person doesn't have to do anything. Shabbos comes. No human effort is needed. Yes, it's a mitzvah to accept Shabbos, but even if you don't accept it, it still comes when it comes. That's why the bracha that we say in the Amidah on Shabbos, Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you God, Mekadesh HaShabbos. You sanctified Shabbos. The sanctification of Shabbos comes directly from God. And therefore, there can be nothing imperfect in the sanctification of Shabbos. It could be that an individual might not observe properly. That is a responsibility of the individual. But on a communal level, there is nothing lacking in Shabbos to have to bring a korban chatas. Now, yes, those are technical details, but what you see in that is an essential difference in the nature of the sanctity of Shabbos versus the sanctity of Yom Tov. We often say that Shabbos is more holy than Yom Tov. It's not just a question of more holy, it's a different type of holiness, because the holiness comes directly from God, whereas the holiness of Yom Tov comes from the Jewish people. Okay. Let's look at another detail. And this, what I want to share with you now, comes from the Rav, Rabbi Yosef Soloveitchik of blessed memory. So, as I said, in this week's Torah portion, we learn every special day in the Jewish calendar has its own special korban. Shabbos has a special korban, Rosh Chodesh, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. Each one has their own special korban, their own special offerings. And, as I mentioned before, in our prayers on those days, we detail what the korban was. That's what we call the Amidah, that we call Musaf. The word Musaf means added. And the reason we have an extra Amidah on Shabbos and Yom Tov and Rosh Chodesh is because in the Beit HaMikdash there was an extra sacrifice in honor of that day. So we have an extra Amidah that is added. Musaf means added. And in that we detail exactly what was offered as the korban on that day. There's one exception. There's one holiday where more than one sacrifice is offered, but the Torah does not detail it, and we in our prayers do not detail it. This would be a good Jeopardy question, but I'm going to give you the answer. It's Rosh Hashanah. Because keep this in mind, Rosh Hashanah is the beginning of the Jewish year. But Rosh Hashanah is also the beginning of the Jewish month. It's Rosh Chodesh. But you'll notice that on Rosh Hashanah, there's very little mention of the fact that it is also Rosh Chodesh. Now you could say, well, because it's overwhelmed, but the fact that it's the beginning of the whole year takes precedence over the fact that it's also the beginning of the month. Okay, all right. But you would expect some mention of it. On Rosh Hashanah, when we say the Musaf Amidah, we mention the sacrifices for Rosh Hashanah. If it's Shabbos, we mention the sacrifices for Shabbos because that's added. But we do not mention the sacrifices offered for Rosh Chodesh, which were offered, but we don't mention them. All we say is the words Milvad Olas HaChodesh, in addition to what was offered by Rosh Chodesh, but we don't detail what was offered on Rosh Chodesh. We know what it is, we just don't mention it. Why don't we mention Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah? So the Talmud gives a kind of a cryptic answer. The Talmud says, Zikaron echad ola lakan ulakan. One mention serves for both. If you mention the sacrifices for Rosh Hashanah, it's as if you already mentioned the sacrifices for Rosh Chodesh also. What does that mean? I know this sounds technical, but I hope to show you it's a really deep lesson. Rav Soloveitchik explains as follows. We mention each sacrifice if there is some difference in the flavor, in the mood, in the nuance of that sacrifice. So, for example, if it's Rosh Hashanah and Shabbos, so that's two different identities. The sacrifices are for different purposes, so we're going to mention both. Or if there is a carbon ola and a carbon chatas, two different kinds of sacrifices, we're going to mention both because one is offered differently than the other. However, the Rav says, Zikaron echad ola lakan lakan means that the holiness of Rosh Hashanah is the same as the holiness of Rosh Chodesh. In other words, Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of each Jewish month, is a miniature version of Rosh Hashanah. In other words, Rosh Hashanah is not just one day a year, but in miniature form every month. The once a year Rosh Hashanah is the same as the monthly Rosh Hashanah in the following way. Obviously, we don't blow shofar on Rosh Chodesh, we don't eat apples and honey, but in the following way, that both of them are a Yom Hadin, a day of judgment. On Rosh Hashanah, we come before God to be judged. Rosh Chodesh is also a Yom Hadin, a day of judgment. Not this Shabbos, but next Shabbos is Rosh Chodesh Av, the beginning of the Jewish month of Av. Of course, that leads to Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. Rosh Chodesh is a Yom Hadin. In the Amidah that we say on Rosh Chodesh, we say the following words. Roshei Chodeshim Lamcha Nasata. We say to God, you gave to your people the beginning of each month, to observe the beginning of each month, Zman Kapara L'chol Totosam, a time of atonement for all of your creation. In other words, the meaning of Rosh Chodesh is not just the way that we mark time. Oh, it's the beginning of the month, so I know what's coming up in that month. It's also a day of accountability. And what we're supposed to do on Rosh Chodesh every month is to think to ourselves about the previous month, the same thing that we're supposed to think to ourselves on Rosh Hashanah about the previous year. What did I do? What was right? What needs to be fixed? What changes do I have to make? To whom do I need to apologize? That is supposed to happen every Rosh Chodesh, just as it happens on an annual basis on Rosh Hashanah. And we derive that lesson from the fact that the sacrifice of Rosh Chodesh is not mentioned on Rosh Hashanah because they share the same idea. It's a really important insight into what it is that we're doing by observing Rosh Chodesh every month. And something we should think about, not this Shabbos, but next Shabbos, the Rosh Chodesh of Av, is a time to think about how did the last month go and what do we need to fix and what could be better. Okay. I want to go back to the beginning of the Torah portion. This week, the Parsha Pinchas. And I have to tell you that this week's Torah portion, it makes me nervous. Not because of what the Torah says, God forbid, but the way that it has been misunderstood and misapplied is something that frightens me very much. So let's just review the narrative at the beginning of this week's Torah portion. At the end of last week's Torah portion, there was a terrible, terrible thing that happened. There was an act of immorality, And there were two people, a man and a woman, who were involved publicly in front of everyone in an act of immorality. And because of that, God brought a plague against the Jewish people, and 24,000 Jewish people died in that plague. In the midst of that hysteria and chaos, there was a man named Pinchas. Pinchas was a grandson of Aharon. He was a Kohen. He wasn't officially a Kohen. That's a technical detail, but he was a grandson of Aaron. And Pinchas understood that the only way to stop this plague was through an act of violence, where he took a spear and he killed this man and this woman, and then the plague ended. That's the end of last week's Torah portion. A very violent, very, very disturbing narrative. Now, clearly it was the right thing to do, because in this week's Torah portion, God rewards Pinchas for what he did. And God says at the beginning, near the beginning of this week's Torah portion, Hineni nosen lo as brisi shalom. I will give to Pinchas my covenant of peace. I will bestow upon Pinchas my special covenant of peace, of shalom. Okay, so what Pinchas did was right. What frightens me is Jews who learn from Pinchas to be a zealot and to use violence in situations where they are not allowed to do so. Because the Talmud records a number of specific requirements that have to be met for this extra-legal vigilante taking the law into one's hands act of violence. And the truth is the criteria, the requirements are so onerous, it's almost impossible for it to happen. This was one example. What frightens me is Jews who ignore the fine print and try to emulate the headlines with catastrophic consequences. And it's happening right now. I mentioned this morning. Another act of Jewish terrorism perpetrated by Jews in Israel, and it's been happening all too often. And I will repeat my stance that there are not enough voices speaking up about the immorality and the anti-Torah values that are expressed by these actions. And also, I think that there's not enough effort by the government and the police and the military to stop it, or at least to hold those people responsible. And this is what some of these people claim. They claim, I'm acting like Pinchas. Some of this is explicit. I'm acting like Pinchas. I'm going to be a zealot for God. But they're doing it in ways and under circumstances that it's not permitted. And the truth is that this goes all the way back to in our history. We find ourselves now in the middle of the 3 weeks leading to Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, which commemorates the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, the first one and the second one. Who destroyed the second temple, the second Beit HaMikdash? Who is responsible for making Tisha B'Av the saddest day of the year? Well, of course, it was the Romans. The Romans destroyed the Beit HaMikdash. It's not so simple. Years ago, I had the privilege to lead a mission to Israel. And we took a tour of the Kotel tunnels You may know about this, you may have done this, that there are tunnels below the surface of what you see at the kotel because the actual wall goes down much, much further. What you see when you go to the kotel and you daven at the kotel, you're only seeing a little bitty piece of the wall. But there are tunnels that have been exposed, and you can take a tour. And if you have not done it, you must put it on your list the next time you go to Israel. It's just fascinating. In any event, we were doing this tour. We had a wonderful guide, and she said something, and it was so simple, but it was so profound, and it was so frightening. So we all know the statement of our sages. Our sages say, no, it wasn't the Romans. The Beit HaMikdash was destroyed because of sinas chinam, needless hatred among Jews. Now, we usually understand that as a punishment, meaning God was upset with the Jewish people because there was needless hatred, and therefore God punished us by allowing the Romans to be able to destroy the Beit HaMikdash. That's a simple way to understand it. And that's true. But it's also even simpler than that. I've shared this with some of you before. There's a fascinating story in the Talmud about what led to the destruction of the Second Temple. Rome laid a siege around Jerusalem. The siege was in place for 3 years. No one went in or out. Usually a siege is a very effective means if you're patient, because you just have to wait till they finish their food and their water. What Rome did not know is that the Jews inside Jerusalem had storehouses of food enough to last for over 20 years. And even more importantly, there was natural spring water inside Jerusalem. So they had its own source of water, couldn't run out of water. So why did the siege only last 3 years? Inside Jerusalem, there were 2 factions. There was a faction that said, we have the storehouses, we have the water, we'll wait them out. Stay patient. Nothing's happening to us now. There's no way that we can fight against Rome. To try to fight against Rome is crazy. So we'll try to wait them out. Maybe they'll lose interest. There was another faction, a group that were called the Baryonai, the Zealots. And they were a group of younger people, more aggressive, and they did not like the idea to just sit back and do nothing. They wanted to attack Rome, which was crazy. I mean, it would have been suicide. But there's the 2 factions, and they're arguing with each other. So how are they going to decide? The Baryonim, this group of aggressive, radical zealots, burned the storehouses, which meant that the people in Jerusalem did not have unlimited food. In other words, they forced the hand. And that is what caused Jerusalem to fall to the Romans. And it's because those individuals, those Baryonim, they wrongly assumed that Pinchas's act of zealotry is the model that they should use, when in fact, none of the circumstances that applied in the situation of Pinchas applied in the situation of Jerusalem at the end of the Second Temple. And because of their action, because of their using Pinchas as a role model incorrectly, that directly led to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash and the exile and dispersal of the Jewish people for 2,000 years. And again, as I said, it continues to haunt us to this day. And that's why this Torah portion makes me so nervous, especially this year, especially now. And I must insist that we have to be crystal clear about what we do and what we do not learn from Pinchas. So let's take another approach. Because it seems odd that God in this week's Torah portion would reward Pinchas, his act of violence, with the words, Hineni nosin lo es brisi shalom. I'm going to give you my covenant of peace. It might have made more sense for God to say, I'm going to give you my covenant of zealotry or something like that. But what he did was not peaceful. So I want to share with you an answer to this that was given by Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein. And it paints a different picture of Pinchas, a different picture than what most of us carry around, and certainly a different picture than those who misuse Pinchas as a role model. The Talmud tells us that Pinchas was a person who did not normally carry any weapon. In general, Pinchas was a person who was a studious, scholarly, spiritual person. His inclination would be to never hurt anyone. But he faced a crisis. He faced a crisis where Jews were dying. 24,000 Jews had already died. And he needed to do something to bring back peace, to stop the death. And he's the only one that was not frozen into inaction because of the hysteria and the chaos and the complexity of it. And he knew what he had to do, but he was acting outside of his nature. Rav Lichtenstein writes, even a person who throughout his life follows the path of peace, if he should take up a spear, even for just one moment, and kill someone, then there's a danger that something within him has changed, that something of his sensitivity will be impaired. And therefore, there was a need for God to respond to Pinchas and to say, Hineni nosin lo es brisi shalom. I'm giving you my covenant of peace. I understand that you're a man of peace. I understand that what you did was correct in the exceptional circumstance, but I understand that you are a person of peace and that is your personality and that is your inclination. And our sages explain that what God did in saying these words was to induct Pinchas to becoming a Kohen. Even though he was a grandson of Aharon, but only those who were born after God inducted Aharon and his 4 sons as Kohanim, only those descendants were a Kohen. But anyone who was already born but not specifically listed was not grandfathered in. God said to Pinchas, I'm making an exception. I'm making you a Kohen. You know all the jokes about a person who says, well, if I can give you a donation, will you make me a Kohen? God made Pinchas a Kohen. let me go into a tangent that will bring us back to this point. Let's go back to the beginning of the Torah. The terrible first act of murder. Cain killed his brother Hevel. Cain killed Abel, murdered his brother. The Torah verses that describe this are very cryptic. The Torah says, Vayichar Cain ma'od. Cain was very angry at Hevel. Doesn't say why. Vayomer Cain el Hevel achiv. And Cain said to Hevel, his brother, but it doesn't tell us what he said. And the next words, Vayakam Cain, and Cain arose and killed Hevel. So our sages give us a little bit more of the scene that helped to flesh out the details. Cain was very angry with his brother Hevel. They were jealous because they each brought an offering to God, and the offering of Hevel was accepted by God, and the offering of Cain was not accepted. Cain was jealous, and he was very angry. So they started to fight. And Hevel was stronger than Cain. Cain was on the ground, and Hevel was on top of him. Hevel was about to kill Cain. And Cain on the bottom, the weaker one, says to Hevel, his brother, how could you do this? I'm your brother. We're both sons of the same Adam and Eve. How could you do this? And Hevel had a moment of mercy for his brother. So that's what Vayomer Cain, that's what Cain said. How could you do this? And at the moment that Hevel had a moment of mercy, Cain jumped on top and killed Hevel. Vayakam Cain, Cain jumped on top. He used that moment of relenting on the part of Hevel. He jumped on top and he killed Hevel. But what about what he just said? He just said to Hevel, how could you kill your brother? Imagine what it's going to do to our parents. Obviously, his own anger overcame that logic. His own jealousy overcame that logic. It all started with jealousy. Our rabbis tell us there's a mitzvah in the Torah called shatnez. Shatnez is a very difficult to understand mitzvah. It means that we're not allowed to wear a garment that has wool and linen woven into the same garment. Why not? They're both perfectly good fabrics. They're both permitted by themselves. You can have linen and cotton. You can have wool and cotton. You can have linen and silk. Why can't you have linen and wool? There are a number of different hypotheses, but our rabbis in the Medrash say as follows. Hevel was a farmer. He brought an offering of an animal. Excuse me, that's not what I meant to say. Hevel was a shepherd. He brought an offering of an animal. Cain was a farmer. He brought an offering of flax that you use to make linen that grows from the ground. The Torah prohibits a garment that includes both something that comes from an animal, wool, and something that comes from the ground, linen, because that combination is what represents that first act of jealousy that led to the first act of murder. So when a Jewish person is careful not to wear such a garment, it's a reminder. Don't ever let anger and jealousy lead to a crime of violence. Okay. The Arizal, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, points out the following. There's one exception. There's actually two, but let's just talk about one. One exception to the laws of shatnez. One exception where a person is allowed, not only allowed, required to wear shatnez. And that is the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. If you look back when we learn the details of the garments worn by the Kohen, you'll notice the avnet, the belt worn by the Kohen Gadol, had both linen and wool. How could it have linen and wool? It's shatnez. How could he wear it? Explains the Arizal, because the job of the Kohen Gadol is to bring peace into the world. The job of the Kohen Gadol is to remind people it's dangerous, don't do it, but I'm wearing it together to remind you that they have to be brought together in peacefulness. Because that's the job of the Kohen. And when a Kohen wears this garment that is shatnez, it reminds the Kohen himself and it reminds us. This is the role of a Kohen. And when God says to Pinchas, Hineni nosin lo as brisi shalom, God is affirming that means you're going to be a Kohen, because the covenant of peace means that you're acting as a Kohen. Because that is the personality that God wants, as is repeated over and over in the Torah. We say this in our prayers, Derachei darchei noam. The ways of the Torah are pleasant, v'chol nesiv aser shalom, and all of its paths lead to peace. Hashem oz lamo yitain, Hashem yivareches amo v'shalom. God gives strength to his people, and God blesses his people with peace. And ultimately, the picture of Pinchas that we should have is the picture of a person whose life is dedicated to peace. And God recognizes that even though there was a moment where he had to act differently, that was outside of his character, not to be emulated, not to use as a role model. I want to share with you a story. I've shared this before. You may have heard it. I find that I need to hear this story every once in a while. It's an amazing story. I heard this story from Rabbi Paysach Krohn. And it's an amazing story that has as its punchline a quote from our Torah portion. The story goes like this. There was a man living in Israel, and his brother, I'm sorry, I already messed up the story. Start over again. There's a man living in New York, a religious man who's living in New York. And he collected some money for tzedakah. There was a family that he knew in Israel that needed financial help. So he collected together some money. It was $1,700. Now, I heard this story maybe 20 years ago, and that was a little bit of money at that time. $1,700. So the man in New York, his brother was traveling to Israel. So he said to his brother, would you be my shliach? Would you be my emissary? Take the $1,700 and give it to so-and-so. Brother said, sure. It's a big mitzvah. I'm happy to do it. The man in New York is waiting to hear from the family in Israel that they received the money, because, of course, as soon as they receive the money, they're going to call him to thank him for this very generous gift. And he approximates the amount of time it would take for his brother to travel there. Maybe he went to sleep first, but he's not hearing from this family. And so finally he calls the family because now he's worried what happened. He calls this family in Israel, and they said to him, "We didn't get anything from you. Nobody came to our house. We don't know what you're talking about." So then he calls his brother in Israel. And his brother says to him, "I am so embarrassed. I am so ashamed. I couldn't even call you to tell you what happened. I put it in the suitcase. I put it in a safe place. I know exactly where it was. I got to Israel. I unpacked my suitcase and I could not find the envelope. And I looked everywhere. I undid everything. I went through everything. And I'm so embarrassed. I couldn't even call you to tell you. I'm just so ashamed of myself." So the brother in New York says, "Don't worry about it. It's okay. It's min hashamayim. It's from heaven. You weren't negligent. Accidents happen." He was understanding. But the brother in Israel still felt terrible, embarrassed, ashamed, humiliated. And when he came home, when he arrived at the airport back in New York, he was worried that his brother was going to be at the airport waiting for him to yell at him. And he deserved it. And in fact, when he got to the airport in New York, his brother was waiting for him. And his brother in New York was holding a cake. And the cake had an inscription. And the inscription on the cake said, "Hineni nosen lo esprisi shalom." "Behold, I give to you my covenant of peace." I don't think a bakery ever in the history of the world had that verse inscribed on top of a cake. But he meant to say, "I'm really serious. There's no issue between us." And that's an important lesson. It's a crucial lesson. Because here's the thing, sometimes things go wrong. Not out of maliciousness, not out of negligence, not out of not caring. Person makes a mistake. And it's a situation where there's a potential for recrimination and upset and anger and not speaking to each other. And when you feel like that about someone else that's done something to you, sometimes the best thing to do is to confront the other person and confront them with a cake that says, "Hineni nosen lo esprisi shalom." It's okay. We're good. And I would hope that this will be the lesson that we take tonight from the narrative of Pinchas. My friends, I wish you a great evening and a beautiful Shabbos. And I look forward to seeing you soon in person